or 30 years now, won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Ivan Bolan's The Historians won the Costa Prize for Poetry. And this year, Victoria Kennefic's first collection is up for both the T.S. Eliot and the Costa Prize for Poetry. So the books of poetry published by the press are at the forefront of people's imagination of what poetry in English looks like, and that's been the case for a long time. So I thought I'm going to start, Michael, by asking you a little bit, though, about how this is a little bit more about the business of publishing, as well as about what your work involves. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you found your way into publishing.
My way into publishing was accidental, and I think you should give all the viewers here a government health warning to say that I am not what you would call a successful publisher, if you measure success in terms of profit. I think we have spent, in the last 51 years, which was now our span, we have made a profit possibly in 3 of those years. And we have been clients of the Arts Council for a very long time. But I got into publishing because I was a very enthusiastic reader. And as an undergraduate at university, I started publishing as well. I published a little magazine, which I took over there, called Carcanet, and started publishing my contemporaries. And I got enthusiastic about their work and decided that before I left university, I would publish a little series of pamphlets. I published, I think, 7 pamphlets, and they were reviewed, oddly enough, this is many years ago, in The Guardian, in The Times, and I think even in the Times Literary Supplement. And they were given very warm welcomes. I published them on a subscription model so that people would pay in advance. I'd met a number of people, writers and so on, when I was at university. And we sold 200 or 300 subscriptions. And so it seemed to me a way of maybe even, surviving in university and maybe earning enough money to pay my keep. So we did another series of pamphlets, which didn't do quite so well, and another which did even worse. So we moved on to book publishing so that we could lose money better and faster. And so I suppose since 1970, we must have published about 1,500 books, not all of them poetry. We had a very big fiction list for a time. We've published quite a lot of books, not any longer, but we did a lot of history books, mainly to do with Portuguese history and Iberian history. And we've published in almost every genre, art books and so on. So it's been we basically published the books that other publishers didn't reach. What we have been very successful in, I'm very pleased to say, because it's my main passion, is in our poetry lists.
Michael, I guess one of the things that people maybe might not understand is how distinctive poetry publishing is and what its model is. But you're somebody who's also, your books have been published by Harville, have been published by Princeton and by Harvard University Press. And so you have a lot of experience. And who published your novels, Michael, remind me?
They were published by a firm that no longer exists called Frederick Muller. And then they were reissued by Gay Men's Press.
Yeah. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it is that makes the poetry publishing model and business so different, say, from the kind of big kind of conglomerate houses and the uni presses that you've worked with, apart from the profit motive.
The big publishers who buy my books tend to be very large. I mean, my history of the novel is about 1,200 pages, and it makes the Bible look like a kind of short story. But the big publishers are making a much bigger investment. First of all, they pay their authors substantial advances. I think the largest advance we ever paid for a book was £3,000. I wouldn't, as it were, get out of bed in commercial terms for less than 10, and for one of my books I got 60. So so in that sense, Carcanet hasn't got enough money to pay the big advances. Even, I have to insist, to our Nobel Prize winners, who even after they get the Nobel Prize don't advance much beyond £1,000 in terms of advances, though they earn a good deal, and we could probably afford to pay them more, couldn't we, John? I think we may have to revisit that if we get any more Nobel Prize winners in the next year or two.
So Chris is recording this.
Oh dear, Chris, we need an edit on that point. But I think that the first investment that a major publisher makes is in the advance. And that advance is basically a commitment not only to the author, but to the reader, to the market. They're basically saying this person is good, and the book will be good. And they're paying really, it's a kind of gambling. The poetry publisher, or some of the smaller literary publishers, I would imagine, like, excellent little houses who are taking a lot of risks, aren't in the same game. It's a very different kind of game. They are taking risks as well, because even though they're spending less money in proportion to the size of their operation, the money they spend is possibly even larger. So if we publish a 144-page book, we're committing to £3,000 or £4,000 in terms of production and so on. Well, that's not negligible by our standards, and so the investment is much, much smaller, but the capital base from which that investment takes place is also much, much smaller. The nature of selling is also very different. When Knopf did my book called Lives of the Poets, they invested heavily in promotion. They actually did very big public events that I had to attend in the States. And they invested a lot in me as a kind of an ambassador for the book, or a salesman for the book. And that's, again, and I was paid for that work, as it were, on the road. Whereas, and the British publisher here, who was Weidenfeld, did the same kind of thing. Whereas I think with poetry publishing, you do try and have a lot of events if you can. We've latterly learned about online events, which are much more pleasurable because you don't have to travel and drink warm white wine while the poet reads. And if you fall asleep, nobody can see you. That's the other thing. But we do a lot of events. Before COVID, we did a huge number of events, and we sold books at those events. We now sell them from our online bookshop. I think it's a matter of scale. The other thing is, here I am in my 51st year as a publisher. And essentially, until latterly, with John's help, I have built the whole list myself. So these have all been a series of judgments by me, an individual. Knopf or Weidenfeld or Harvard or Princeton all have a kind of succession of editors. The editor is doing a job. There is a salary attached to it. The editor moves from one job to another. And you don't have that sense of continuity, which you do have with some of the smaller presses. Most of them, Blood Axe, for example, run by Neil Astley, Anvil, which we took over, but which was run for about 40 years by Peter Jay. Most of the independent presses do have this continuity of editorial. Not that the continuity means sameness, because Carcanet has moved from what you might call almost a movement base with, I don't know how many of you are students of the mid-50s onwards, but one of the dominant movements was called The Movement, a pretty undistinguished title, which was succeeded by a group called The Group. And so it has gone on. But there is a great evolution, I think, in the Carcanet list. John, you probably.
I do agree. And I love the idea that you're talking about the small presses having what you're calling continuity of leadership, but what the Arts Council calls single point of failure. Michael, can you talk a little bit about, when you started off running the press and when you were organizing a subscription model and when you were kind of negotiating with bookshops yourself and working with funders and with the Arts Council and so on, and now it's maybe a more complicated environment, but there's a staff in terms of sales, in terms of marketing, in terms of communication. Can you talk a little bit about what the spread of the company is, and how vital the different roles are to the press's success?
Yes, I think one thing that most of you who are here today won't realize is how totally different the environment of publishing has become from what it was 50 years ago. In those early days, I used to go and have tea with the most important bookseller in Oxford, who's Sir Basil Blackwell. His book chain is still going, and he urged me to put little racks in the main bookshop in the Broad Street in Oxford, so that our pamphlets could be displayed best to best advantage. And even when Waterstones began, Waterstone himself used to come up to Manchester. He liked the Manchester shop very much, and I used to see him regularly and so on. Now that's all moved way off. I no longer see the head of Waterstones. I no longer see the head of the wholesalers. Even the agents, some of them aren't able to see down to the low level that I exist at. But our books are now. We have representatives in most of the areas of the world, in many individual countries, and our books sell into them. Certainly when we got the Nobel Prize this last time, it opened a huge number of doors for export, which was very exciting. Just in time, of course, for the change in the nature of export after Brexit, which means that we find it much more difficult now to sell into Europe. In terms of unit sales, I've said this to John often enough, we used always to publish 1,000 hardbacks and 1,000 paperbacks of a new book. The library market at that time was the absolute underpinning of publishing. So there were major library suppliers called Richard Abel was the main one that I remember. And they would sell as much as a third of all of our sales. They were due to the library suppliers. And now libraries, of course, are a very, very small portion of our market. And the bookshops themselves were quite a large portion of the market, so they would absorb the paperbacks. We now publish, when we do a new book, we used to, as I say, to do 2,000 copies, 1,000 hard and 1,000 paper. We now do very short runs, probably 600 copies, because the technology of printing is such that you can now do short runs at a reasonable margin. Sometimes we do fewer, and then we reprint to demand. So we will still sell with something like one of Louise Gluck's books, for example, or Caroline Bird. We'll sell in the thousands, in case of both of those authors, 10,000 and more. But in other cases, really good books which get well reviewed and so on will sell as few as 200. And what else? Yeah, and bookshops. In Manchester used to have 6, I think, really very interesting bookshops into which all of our books sold. And we as publishers are enjoined to support the independent bookselling sector. But the independent bookselling sector no longer supports the independent presses, or sorry, the indecent presses, as we have to call ourselves. So there are probably 12 or maybe as many as 15 independent booksellers in the country who really do genuinely support Carcanet and the other independent presses. But the vast majority of the 400 or 600, however many there are, simply don't. And if they do support us, they will support us for a customer order, and they will get the book from one of the wholesalers.
Yeah, very good. And Michael, the team that works with the sector, has that also, was there so there are 2 people who work in marketing and communications, one on design, you as the editor, there's 2 in finance, because rights and permissions are a really important part of what the press does as well. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about marketing and communications and why that, and sales, and what skills you look for in people to do those jobs. Or
yes, well, you're an excellent editor yourself. So, and I think without you, Carcanet would be a good deal slower in the water as the swimming flippers deteriorate. But yes, I think the most important person in the history of Carcanet was my original secretary, a woman called Pam Heaton, who was with me for 27 or 28 years and got to know everything about the press. So if another colleague left, she would be able to instruct them and to help train them. And I gradually became very dependent on her. She retired, and I've never had a secretary since then. So I've become my own secretary. That is not, if you ever become publisher, it's not a role that you should aspire to. Being a secretary is a really difficult job. She also did all my typing from dictation. Now I do my own typing. I think the most important person is probably the accountant. And with an accountant, you want somebody not necessarily interested in books, but someone who understands and comes to really understand the business of books. First of all, what is required legally in terms of accounting and the exchequer, but also how how to cost a book, because costing is terribly important, and how you get a margin. In the old days, you tried to, if a book cost £1 to produce, you would anticipate selling it for £4 because the bookshops took a small discount. You paid the royalty and you paid a commission and dispatch. But now you look for a markup of 7, 8, 9 times because the people like Amazon take over 50% of the income from a book, sometimes over 60%. And so, you know, the producer used to be in control, but now the producer is very much a servant of the main suppliers. Will you excuse me just one half a second while I put this brief on?
I think one of the things that people don't realize is that we have no control over the prices that Amazon set on the books, so that you know, you can discover that your book has been discounted to half nothing and you've got to just swallow it. Michael, isn't that right?
Yeah, that's true. That was, by the way, my finance director calling, so I had to answer. You see how important she is. But I've told her I was Zooming, so she gives me a bit of leniency. What you were saying about sales and marketing is very important. The marketing team is different from the sales team. The sales person oversees sales, makes sure that the stock is turning over properly, that we get reprints in time, and he also does all the permissions. So he's basically looking at sales. When you publish a book, you get lots of properties. You get the book itself, you get the ebook, the audiobook, and you get the subsidiary rights. So many of our authors, like Robert Graves, for example, most of the money that estate earns, and it's a lot of money, comes from subsidiary rights. Every time you quote a little bit of The White Goddess, or every time you quote one of Graves's poems, you have to pay us money, which we collect on behalf of the author, keeping part of it ourselves. So if we're at the case that our turnover from rights was £100,000 a year, 50,000 of that goes into our own exchequer, as it were, and the other 50 is sent out to the writers. So we have an excellent person to do that. Now he doesn't have to be a literary person. It so happens that our current sales manager is literary. He writes novels, which he actually publishes through Amazon, and he's been quite successful with that. And he also likes poetry very much. So, and he's a graduate from Bolton, who was a very promising student there, and they're very pleased that he came to Carcanet. Then you have the marketing people have to be very articulate. They have to be able to do social media, which I'm never quite sure how important social media are, but I do admire what they do, and they get the press's name out there. They also exceptionally are attentive to awards. I guess you'd agree, John, that in the olden times, even when you were younger, which isn't all that long ago, there was a really strong review culture in literary publishing. It wasn't just the TLS, it was the Times, the Guardian, the Independent, the Listener, which no longer exists, the New Statesman, had really a huge commitment to and an investment in book reviewing. And that's really, apart from the market leaders, as it were, the people who put a lot of money into promoting their books and advertising in these journals, the review culture is much diminished. So you have to make your own luck. And you make your own luck by having online events, by getting statements from famous writers about your writers, which you can then publicize, and so on. And the ingenuity, I think, of the marketing department is in finding ways of making noise about books which the media aren't really attending to. So they're very good art marketing people, and devising as well.
Yeah. That's great, Michael. Now I'm going to remind everybody, please do pop questions for us into the chat, because I wanted to ask Michael a little bit now about can you okay, that was your little ad break. So that's PN Review. That's why I'm not in the marketing section of Carcanet. So PN Review, Michael.
We'll read about the old issues. Okay, this is
So PN Review it's in 2023, Michael. It's going to be 50 years old.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So, and PN Review is it's a great journal. I have loved reading it ever since I started reading poetry. It has essays, it has reviews, it has sort of obituaries, notices of news, and every 2 months an editorial, a State of the Nation from Michael. And it's sort of cartoons, there it had anyway. Everything you could want in a literary journal is in PN Review, but it serves a really important, while prize culture, is itself the subject of PhDs and much academic discussion about how it is structuring the literary environment, in the same way, that you have Marxist scholars talking about fiction, which is being shaped by Amazon as the seller. PN Review kind of maintains another tradition, which is that poems and books of poetry exist as parts of arguments for and against ideas. But it serves a real function in terms of finding new writers for the press as well, Michael. And I just wondered if you, because I know you love Carcanet, but really, you love PN Review, yeah?
The reason you love the reason I, as the editor, love PN Review is that most of my best authors have come to me through PN Review. Some of them were poets who are publishing for the first time, and I really liked their work and worked with them on their work. People like Sinead Morrissey, Sophie Hannah, who's become a very famous popular novelist, and also when I was teaching more full time, you would actually draw students, as it were, whose work you liked. You'd induce them, as it were, to come and study with you. It was a way of grooming potential poets, So if I can use that rather loaded term. So it was a joy. For example, there's a poet called Kai Miller, of whose work I'm very fond, and I think I must have come upon him through PN Review. And he was going to go to Falmouth, and I got him to come to Glasgow when I was teaching there, and so on. He's a wonderful poet. I believe he came to us through PN Review. So it's like a kind of fishing net. And the thing about the difference between publishing a first collection and publishing the poet in the magazine is, first of all, when you're still at the white heat of enthusiasm, the poems appear, and that's exciting. You see them. You can like a poet's work, and within 3 months you can get quite a chunk of it into print in the magazine. That's fun. But also it's a way of drawing in established poets who like your magazine and begin sending you work I suppose Les Murray, maybe John Ashbery. He liked PN Review. He was one of his favorite magazines. Tom Gunn and Elizabeth Jennings, who was a great friend of mine when I was at university, used to send us work as well. And in the end, then you, on the strength of this, as you build up the reputation of the magazine, you can then solicit work from the poets that you really, really want to be close to. And so that's how it's worked. So, and if you were interested in the evolution of the editorial evolution of the press, PN Review would be the place to as it were monitor it, because you can make mistakes in a journal and leave them behind. They don't, as it were. Whereas a book which you publish by mistake is sitting there in the warehouse wagging its finger at you for a long, long time.
And it has an amazing circulation still, so it's got 1,200 or so subscribers as well as its bookshop sale and things, which is really, really high for a journal, and it is one of the kind of weather makers of what contemporary poetry looks like and what is praised and celebrated and argued about still. Chris asks a question here, Michael, which it's a question, about how do Carcanet find poets, and one way is definitely through PN Review. But then he also asks, do poets have agents? And with your Professor of Poetry and Creative Writing hat on, Michael, you must encourage all of your students to try and find an agent who will represent them well. But as a publisher, what do you think of agents, Michael?
Well, for many years, I refused to read submissions from agents, which is a bit stupid, really, because I felt that anyone who had gone to an agent as a poet had the wrong motives. I mean, I would go to an agent, of course, for your prose books, but poetry is a rather different kettle of fish. And nowadays, agents are taking on poets. They believe the myth that poetry sells well, because everyone says poetry is now selling great, and some of it does sell tremendously well. But also, they hope that they'll go on and write novels and other kinds of books. So you do find a lot of poets come to you represented by agents.
There are only four agents, four of the main agencies that have these agents, but younger poets do, Chris, have, they represent quite a bank of younger poets now. And we've certainly taken on a few, Michael, haven't we, over the last couple of years?
Oh yeah, yes, over the last, certainly since you've been here, because you're much more patient with the industry than I am. But yes, we've got some very good poets who happen to be agented, and good luck to them. I've never let my agent loose on my poetry. I've always let my agent do the prose writing. But I not that my poetry is very significant, but I've always insisted on. It means that you can dictate the terms. You can say to your publisher, "I don't want my royalties. I want you to, I want you to sell my book and profit from it," sort of thing. Yeah.
Very good. Are there further questions from you on this increasingly dark December evening here in Manchester or wherever you are? Maddie.
I mean, I guess I'm curious, as you talk about the overall non-profitability of poetry, what keeps you going with it then?
I've never been very interested. I had a relatively prosperous childhood and upbringing, and I've never been very interested in money as a result. So what keeps me going physically is that I teach and I write books, and that's how I subsidize my vice, if you like. What keeps me going is that I love poetry, and I am still being surprised. I don't think if you're a real editor, you get over being surprised. And so, for example, someone on the indecency front, someone sent me some translations of Catullus last year, which were translated into a strange idiom drawn from shibari rope bondage customs in Japan, which may sound outrageous. I didn't really know what the translations were doing. I just started reading them and thinking, these are terrific and strange and wonderful. And we did that book called Shibari Carmina this year, and it's been wonderfully successful. It had the lead review in the LRB just last week. Another time, about 2 or 3 years ago, I received poems which made me laugh out loud. They were not satirical or anything. They were immensely funny, just deeply funny, semantically funny, funny in narrative. And so I immediately wrote to this person and said, "I love your work. Can I publish you?" And it turned out he's well into his 80s, and he published first in the 60s and then vanished from sight. And it's that kind of surprise. And also, obviously, there are the wonderful young writers who really do thrill you because they're doing things that you've not seen done before. Yet they're writing within a tradition, a series of traditions that I value and recognize. So I guess that's what keeps me going. Is just excitement.
And it's quite addictive, Michael, as well. Because there is a great excitement in opening the post and in seeing, what comes in on any given. Like it's remorseless because they're just so. It's like the sea. It just beats and beats and beats. But it is fascinating.
Yeah, I must say COVID was a great sort of muse, wasn't it? We got more submissions than ever from COVID, and many of them are about COVID. So COVID seems to be more than just a kind of accidental muse. And not many of them are any good, which was also sad. But the thing is, as John was saying, the volume of work you receive is enormous, and the ratio of pleasurable submissions to not pleasurable submissions is very, very small. But that rate, when you do hit something wonderful, then you really are thrilled. And you've had some really exciting acquisitions too, John, haven't you?
Oh yeah, it really is. It's so exciting when you come across somebody who's able to hit a note and sustain it across 50 or 60 and then sustain it. And that's the tricky bit. We find poems for the magazine with somebody who might have something exceptional, but can they do it? Can they write poems page after page after page in a manuscript? And it's really tricky. And it's great talking. It's one of the pleasures of the work is being able to talk about poetry with Michael and then, and figure out what is working and what isn't. And I think that's probably the same at every, I think that's something that Luke probably talked about as well, and Ella when she was talking about the books that she takes on also. And we are looking for things. We're always looking. We always want the next one.
That's true. Yes. Yeah, so I think it gets harder and harder. Once the list is very full, as it is now, we have probably about 100 poets that we would publish come hell or high water. It means that there are fewer openings for new poets, but people still break through. And every year, probably 6 or 7 people break through. Certainly this year, John, we've had quite a large harvest of new poets.
Yes, we will have, but four or five first collections in most years. And then I guess then there's a little rate of attrition about whether people will have a second book or not.
Yes.
But then there are people who just won't stop writing, who you have been publishing for 50 years. And they keep coming back.
We have one of my oldest, probably my oldest living poet now, is a man called Stanley Moss, he himself is a wonderful American publisher and poet. And he is unable to stop writing. And I was saying to John the other day, the poetry is wonderful. He writes with this wonderful alertness to semantic nuance and a strange ear, which is always doing funny things. There's wonderful poetry, but the poems themselves aren't quite there because he doesn't linger. He doesn't actually conclude anything. What was it Auden said? You don't finish a poem, you abandon it. Well, it is like a kind of flood. Some of the water is very, very limpid and beautiful, and some of it is very stormy, and some of it's rather hackneyed. I developed a term the other day.
Michael, sorry, you're going to have to tell them how old Stanley is.
Oh, Stanley's 98 now, I think. And he still drives his car from Upper New York State into Manhattan to see his eye doctor because he has no central vision. So he goes down the freeway, in the fast lane at 40, he's having to look like, out of his corneas, if you like, rather than out of his pupils. I don't know how he survived. And he just had his license renewed for another 6 years, so he can drive till he's 104. I like the United States. There's so much freedom there. Well, of sorts. No, I was going to say that the other day, I think one of the things that's happened since I've been a publisher is creative writing has happened. When I started, there were no creative writing schools or programs. I think UEA must have begun 3 or 4 years after maybe we started. No, it must have begun just shortly before, but UEA wasn't created for poets. It was created for novelists. Malcolm Bradbury had mainly novelists to start with. So there wasn't this habit of the workshop, which, and I've always argued with John, and he disagrees with me, and I disagree with me too some of the time, that workshops tend to create a kind of homogeneity. You can talk about Amazon-shaped novels. You can also talk about workshop-shaped poems. And there's certain tricks that you learn to do. I mean, as John Ashbery became more and more popular in the UK, I kept seeing more and more Ashbery-esque poems coming into the magazine and coming into the press. And they weren't Ashbery. They were people who were doing a kind of Ashbery karaoke. And I think this is the case with workshops too. You learn various tricks and you can perform really well. So as I've often said to John too, when we're looking through submissions, you have the pile of rejections, which is, immediate rejects, which is relatively small. You have the pile of acceptances, which is tiny. And then you have this huge middle pile of things that we call plausible. And they're the people who can do the tricks, but are the tricks actually being done to any purpose, to any valid original end? And that's, I think, what has made the job of the editor more complicated than it was before.
Just to say as well, like we did when we opened the submissions window for a fortnight at the end of June, we had 600 full manuscripts came in a fortnight, and we picked maybe 6 or 7. No, maybe 5 actually, Michael. I think
Well, you very kindly wrote to a number of them, suggesting that we might consider them for the next New Poetry's anthology if they kept working, and some of them went into the magazine. But I don't think we took as many as 6. Maybe it was. Yeah, you were in charge of that exercise. I hid under my blanket.
But that sense, Michael's sense of skillful poems, which are not quite at the level that we'd want to publish a book, and it makes me very sad. It makes me very sad, because you really want the work to have pushed ahead these obviously skillful and intelligent writers, but it's just not quite there for us in terms of wanting to push the boat out on a book and a commitment to them as a poet, which we kind of take very seriously. So it's a very, very hard choice at that stage. We might see if there are 1 or 2 more questions from anybody from anybody else here today? Ambrose.
Ray, that's Ambrose. I was wondering, you weren't a machine, you're a real person.
Hi. The work you've been doing is absolutely fascinating. I think I met John at States of Independence many years ago.
Yes.
And yeah. My question is around almost like traditions in poetry, around how when I started looking at poetry, especially what is written about it in this country, a lot of it tends to focus on, the pastoral, countryside, nature, and very little response to contemporary issues or to political issues. I don't know, what has your experience been?
Well, can I step in for a second on that, Michael, just to say that, what Michael said earlier about the pandemic, we like the poetry that we get so much stuff in, Ambrose, that is absolutely responding to the very moment we're in. And it is interchangeable. And that's one of the really weird things about it, is that, the number of poems that have the word hug in it, and it's a terrible thing, but the word hug, I can no longer even see it without thinking of care homes. And it's become a sort of one of these little bywords in a way that's really, so writing about what's contemporary in a significantly original way is one of the hardest things, one of the very hardest things to do, I think. So anyway, that was my first response. Michael, I'll let you off, but.
I totally agree, and I think one of the other problems that I always have is that there is a kind of homogeneous kind of politics, if you like, in the area that I occupy politically. That is to say, I read The Guardian, and I'm always rather shocked at how there is so little originality of thought. In other words, a lot of the poetry that we receive that is about contemporary events and issues is effectively poetry journalism. And it's poetry journalism which is full of feeling, and I'm not interested in how people feel. I'm interested in the subjects, and so frankly, with a lot of the issues that are raised in poetry, all I'm looking at when I look at the poetry is the poetry. I'm not looking at the issues. You have lots and lots of ecology anthologies at the moment, which contain some very good poems, and they have a lot of karaoke poems in them because people are responding in conditioned ways. Again, I find this a little bit with the response to this new variant of COVID. Immediately the polarities are established because they've been established by journalism in some ways. But I hear what you're saying, and a lot of the poets that we publish do have very marked politics and take political stances in their poems. Even if I can enjoy a poetry, if it's good poetry, where I disagree with the political stance. And there is a lot of poetry which I don't enjoy, but we publish because I think it's important. Frankly, poets that like Ed Dorn, whose work I don't. It won't find its way into my heart, and yet I think he's an important and significant writer. Or Charles Olson, who we also publish. I think they're resources for other poets, and they were resources for me as well. And they change the way one approaches language and so on. One doesn't, I think, have to like what one publishes, but one has really to respect it. And don't you think, John? There are lots of poets that we publish that.
I do, yeah. Although, I think one of the things, Ambrose, you're saying about the sort of pastoral traditions in England, I guess that is not something that would define Carcanet in any way, because it's always been very international. It has a really strong North American list. It has a big Irish list, a really strong Scottish list. And also the Caribbean list is really, it's the best Caribbean list, anywhere really. So and say one of the so there it would be absolutely opposed to that parochial kind of sense of the narrow traditions of a certain kind of English poem. I think, you know, it would include some English poets and certainly some Welsh poets who are writing in that tradition, but it's very, very broad church of poets, I think. Michael?
Yeah, I do love that tradition myself. I mean, I'm not English. I came from Mexico. I'm still a Mexican citizen, and I one of the reasons I stayed in England was because I loved the tradition. I love the tradition that's rooted in not because of my religion, but because of the language. It's rooted in the King James Bible and the Book of Common Prayer, and I respond very strongly to the Jacobean and even the 18th century poets, who most of my students find rebarbative, I find very exciting in lots of ways. So there is so much wealth in the literature of the British past. And I was going to suggest that a lot of poets who are doing the karaoke poems would benefit hugely from just reading deeply, not just anthology-wise, but reading deeply in the poetry of the English past. Because I don't know how you feel, John, you being closer to the rock face than I am, but I often have poets who are really quite unaware of the 18th century or even the 17th century, which is even more exciting, the 18th. And you get this feeling that for them, poetry is something that's almost entirely modern, almost entirely, what Ambrose was saying about responding to issues and events, that it has to have a kind of politics.
Yeah, well, I think that I always think, I guess, the more that you can tell poets who know what might have been written about the same subject previously. And you know what I mean? That they know what other people are already, they have a sense of what's happening in the field, and whether that's in the contemporary field or in the past. And the thing that you just notice, first thing that comes in the door is you think, oh, here's an original. Here's a note that hasn't been struck before. And the sheer excitement of it, and because their originality, I know, Michael, you're not gone on that use of the word originality, but the freshness of what they say is fresh because they know what other people are saying and they know they're doing something different. And that's something which I think I love about Carcanet, even if sometimes some of it can be tricky, trying to figure out exactly what's going on, but the excitement of somebody trying to do something in a new way is important. Now, Mike, I've got another question for you here, which is if you could talk about operating as a publisher in Manchester. And it's about, what are the benefits and what are the negatives of being an independent publisher here?
I can. Can you let me briefly go and visit the plumbing? I'm an old man and I occasionally have to do this. Can you entertain the crowd while I disappear briefly?
I certainly can. Does anybody have another question for me about Carcanet or about poetry? Do shout. You're going to encourage me. I'll read a poem to you if you're not careful. Daryl.
Yeah, I mean, a question that was kind of coming to me as you were talking there was, about how you separate out those kind of skillful and intelligent poets from the ones that you accept. And is that kind of, are you looking for somebody saying something new? Is that what you're prioritizing? And if so, how does that something new get balanced against what you were talking about a moment ago, which is, poets also knowing what has come before them? Yeah,
it's a good question, Daryl. And it's one of the subjectivities of editorial work. The only thing I would say is that, I worked as a reviewer for many years in the for newspapers as well as for magazines, which means that I'm one of those people who I've read an awful lot of contemporary poetry. So I know the landscape really, really well, and I think that's really important for an editor. And then, say, if I'm reading 600 submissions, I get to recognize what are the characteristic styles and modes of the moment, and I can see who the influences on these people are. And an awful lot of poetry, even quite good poetry, is like other poetry. So you're looking for something which knows where it comes from, but also snaps into a different mode as well. And I can see such talented poets. You know, I had to write a rejection letter last week to somebody who we took some poems for PN Review, which we really liked. And then the manuscript came in. And Michael, I was talking to you about this poet, and I was saying, you know, it's a very accomplished piece of work. We liked a few of the poems, but I was saying, actually, this poet is really like John Clegg, and really like
Adam Crawley,
Ollie Hazard, and just a couple of poets who are already on the Carcanet list. And the terrible thought I had is like, we already are doing that. And even though these are very skillful kind of iterations in a slightly different mode from it, there's no point in us, when we could be trying to figure out we should be investing in a newer in a poet who's taking more risks, as well as knowing where they come from. So it's our sense of, and Daniel here is asking about about getting involved in Carcanet, and I guess it's because I was on the board of Carcanet, Daniel, and working with Michael for many years, and we meet to talk about poetry all the time because we both are omnivorous readers of poetry and talking about books. And so we have this sense of where new poets fit in the landscape, and we do read very, very widely, I guess, to try and make the decisions about what will make it across the line. Does that answer your question, Daryl? Yeah.
Yeah, about the question of Manchester, I think that poetry publishing, as opposed to commercial publishing, has always thrived outside the urban centre of London. So you have Blood Axe, you have Carcanet, you have a lot of smaller presses are well outside London. And also some of the inventive literary presses, fiction presses as well. I did, and when I first came to Manchester, and ever since I've been here, there has been a really strong community of poets. Some of them very good, some of them nationally famous, others really accomplished within a smaller sphere, a more local sphere. I think what's happening now is odd because a lot of the London companies, the big ones, are opening offices in the north. And I rather mischievously suggested the other day in a similar event to this, on which there was a panel on which one of the new editors from the south, as it were, was present. I just asked her how this was different from colonization, because we had an industry here that was different from the London industry and so on. And what's happened here is that they have opened offices, which have been closed all during COVID, so they haven't really opened offices. They have begun to look for writers, and they found some, and they've done a very, very good job in that respect. They've pushed up wages in the publishing sector, which of course for some of us is extremely disruptive because we pay very, very meager wages and we can't afford to pay larger wages. They've poached some of our staff and they've poached some of our authors, and so there's a curious sense in which they, instead of strengthening the visibility of the North in the country, they are in fact weakening it by imposing these London models on Manchester. It was mischievous, but not entirely without content, I think. I don't know, John, maybe I was unfair.
I thought it was a great intervention, and I think it probably gave a terrible fright because the companies tell the story that they're doing it out of great benevolence, that they're coming to investigate the terrible darklands and weird outskirts of the world, which is anywhere outside of NW7 or NW1, I should say, even. So it's I think it's a great intervention, and it should teach them to mind their manners, which is what we're all about, really. But the advantages are I suppose the poetry businesses are not money making, and that's a massive advantage for an independent press, isn't it, to be able to use kind of a relatively cheaper location and to have fewer costs in terms of staff and rent and so on, because you're outside of the center.
But we are, of course, we do have another kind of bondage, and that is to say that we are clients of the Arts Council, and the Arts Council makes many conditions for our work, which most of which I accept and agree with. But if were they to pull the plug on us, I think it would be very damaging. I wonder if we could survive. Their contribution is the equivalent to probably a quarter of our running costs, and that is we turn over for out of interest, we turn over about £500,000 a year, and their contribution to that turnover, if you like, because we don't usually make a profit, is £127,000, which sounds like a lot of money, but when you're producing 40 books a year and 6 issues of a magazine and keeping a very substantial backlist of maybe 800 books in print, it's a reasonable investment for the taxpayer, I would argue, at least for the poetry taxpayer.
Yeah. Even hearing those numbers is making me feel already like I'm never going to get home tonight, Michael.
I'll contribute to your bus fare.
All right. Well, I think we might we might thank Michael for talking to us tonight, and we'll be back next week. Thank you, Michael. A pleasure always to hear you talking about this.
That's good, John. And one other thing to say is that those of you who are really interested in getting into publishing, we do have an internship program which is asleep at the moment, and with this new Omicron or moronic variation, it may be asleep for a bit longer. But if you are still around in Manchester in 6 months, 8 months time, do write to me. We have a huge number of people applying for a week or 2 week placements, but we do choose those who are most interested in literature and ideally in poetry as well. So you can try and reserve a place. Talk to John about it.
Do indeed. And I guess one of the questions about that for us is that there's just nobody in it because we're not working in the office as a group, so we can't mentor at the moment. So that's we're
trying to devise projects which will be creative, and you'll have to be stuck here with me for a week. If you're allowed to, of course, you may not be allowed to.
If we're allowed to, God damn it. Very good. Thank you very much, Michael. And Chris, you might be able to tell us about what's going to be happening next week for the last week. I think next week we should possibly all of us bring along some cake or something, and have independent cake sharing on our screens or something like that, because it'll be the end of it. And thank you very much. It's great to see so many of you and see the same names that you've come back again this week. Chris, do you want to say what you're going to be talking about next week?
Yes, so we're going to be doing the marketing session, and we'll be talking about, similar to what Michael spoke about author profile, and just also how you go about selling books and advertising them as well, and general promotions. So yeah, so it'll be good for to learn more about the industry, and also as a new time author, what you need to know to market your books.
Very good. All right. Well, see you all next week. Bye-bye.